speaker tonight. Kathy joined Connecticut River Conservancy in 2017 as river steward in Vermont and New Hampshire. Kathy holds an MS in Natural Resource Management from Antioch, New England University, a BA in Psychology from Rutgers, and is a former Vermont Leadership Institute Fellow from the Snelling Center for Government. She lives in Brattleboro with her family, is a self-taught amateur botanist and herbalist, and enjoys constantly relearning about the natural world through the eyes of her two children. So I think that's it for me for now, Kathy, and I'll let you take it away.
Great, thanks so much. So nice to see everybody. Thanks for coming and joining tonight. I'm going to share my screen here and drag you kicking and screaming through some detailed information about the relicensing of these hydroelectric facilities. So again, as Ginevra said, I'm Kathy Erfer. I'm river steward for Connecticut River Conservancy in New Hampshire and Vermont. The organization has been around since 1952, working on the river and trying to protect the river for those many, many decades. So it's my privilege to have joined the organization in 2017. We work in Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, and do all kinds of different work, policy work, on the ground restoration projects. We do an annual Source to Sea river cleanup coming up at the end of September. Education and outreach, and try to tackle invasive aquatic species, etc. So have our hands in a lot of things, all with the goal of protecting the river and helping to maintain the connection and the economies of the local river communities, right, for all river users. So this I'm going to dive in here to this hydroelectric relicensing. It's a thick subject, so bear with me. I'll try to get through the information fast so we have time to answer questions, because there's always a lot of questions prompted by this. So one of the things we do is work with dams, both from this perspective of kind of watchdogging or involving ourselves in the regulatory process for hydroelectric dams, but also for those dams that are not being used in the watershed, we try to take them out to repair the river. And because of our history, there are thousands of dams in Vermont alone in the Connecticut River. Some of the issues with dams is just blocking the flow of the river. It changes habitat bottom. It changes the temperature and the amount of dissolved oxygen in the river, obviously is an impediment to humans going up and downstream, but also fish going up and downstream. So it is a big focus of our work. The relicensing is handled essentially by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So this federal commission issues licenses for hydroelectric and other energy generation projects. The license terms are generally 30 to 50 years long. So we often say this is a once in a lifetime opportunity, and we mean it, right? There will not be another conversation like this about these facilities for probably 40 years. And so FERC, the jurisdiction comes initially from the Federal Power Act. And in 1986, there was this idea included that FERC needs to give equal consideration to a variety of things when they're thinking about these relicensings. Power and development, obviously, but they are also supposed to consider energy conservation, the protection of our fish and wildlife species, recreation, and preservation of other aspects of environmental quality, which includes historic preservation. It includes integration of cultural considerations for Native peoples, and then obviously water quality as well. So when you think about it, it's a federal process, and because of our other federal laws, these things sort of need to be held on par with each other. So you have the Federal Clean Water Act and Section 401 of the Federal Clean Water Act, which gives the states authority to protect water quality in their state using the state's water quality standards. There's the National Historic Preservation Act, protecting our historic resources. The Endangered Species Act, which is watching out for some of the migratory species and other endangered species that live in the river. And then the National Environmental Policy Act, which requires that there be an a cumulative environmental analysis of this process. And so all of these are supposed to be held on par with the need to generate electricity. So just to sort of put us in place and time, the three facilities I will be focusing on are the Wilder, Bellows Falls, and Vernon dams, all in the river in between Vermont and New Hampshire. These three are owned by a company called Great River Hydro. And then included in this relicensing are two other facilities in Massachusetts, the Northfield Mountain Pump Storage Facility and the Turner's Falls Dam. And so FERC is considering all of these together. And so, if one slows down, it sort of can hold up the other company's process. So the two in Massachusetts are owned by a company called First Light Power. A little bit of background information about Great River Hydro. This is an LLC. So these facilities for many years were owned by TransCanada, and they were sold in, I think, 2017 to this parent company called ArcLight, which is an asset-based, essentially, investment firm in Boston. They set up Great River Hydro as an LLC to manage these particular projects. And Great River Hydro as a company manages these three facilities. There are additional hydroelectric facilities further north on the Connecticut River called 15 Mile Falls. And then there are also some facilities on the Deerfield River. So that is sort of all of the assets held by Great River Hydro. Great River Hydro is an LLC held by ArcLight Capital out of Boston. So I'm going to explain a little bit how the facilities have been functioning for the past 40 years to provide some context, and then also what the company has proposed going forward. This graph here is showing the impoundment behind the Bellows Falls Dam for a period in 2014 from June to August. And so the facilities have been functioning as what are called hydro peaking facilities, meaning that as the water comes down the river, it gets held behind the dam generally until about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And so if you think of the area behind the dam as a bathtub, it's like the bathtub slowly fills up until you hit around 4 o'clock or typically when electricity prices go up, and then the company will generate. So then they'll start passing water and generate from 4 to 10. It's not exactly, but when electricity prices are higher every day. And then that bathtub essentially will drop down as they're passing water to generate. When they generate, they're moving from having very little water going downstream to a huge amount of water going downstream. So you could almost think of it as like turning on a storm, right? When the turbines are turned on. The graph here is showing the change in the water surface elevation behind the Bellows Falls Dam for these months in 2014. And so what you see here is the blue line is the furthest north. It's about, I would say 20 miles above the dam. And there are very steep surface water elevation fluctuations, generally 2 to 3 to more feet. And then the red line is sort of in the middle of the impoundment, and the green line is very close to the dam. And so you can see there's a sort of sway in how the water responds in that daily fluctuation. But what you see here is essentially the peak of them passing the water in the afternoon every day. So a little bit of the history. The process began in 2012 with sort of a period of public outreach and scoping to identify what studies should be done during the course of this relicensing. So essentially what things need to be looked at to ascertain if the facility is having an impact on the river, on the surrounding communities, et cetera. And so in the end, they were required to do around 33 studies looking at recreation, dragonflies, migratory fish, whitewater recreation, erosion along the river, all different kinds of things. There have been several delays. Normally, a typical relicensing would take about 5 years. There's been several delays in the process. And the studies were not completed until 2019. So we're just now kind of getting to what would be considered a final application in this process. So we were able to have conversations with Great River Hydro between May and November of 2020. That was Connecticut River Conservancy, the Nature Conservancy, fisheries biologists from both states and the US Fish and Wildlife Service, and state staff who manage the 401 certificate in both states. And so we were pleased to be able to come to some agreement about how the company could operate these facilities in the future that would be more beneficial to the river. They included this new operation in their amended final license application that was submitted in December of 2020. And so I'll explain the difference a little bit. What you're looking at here are hydrographs of the outflow of water from the Wilder Dam. And so there's 9 different years here covering the months of July to October. If you look at the green one in the middle right, that huge line that goes up is Tropical Storm Irene. So what you're seeing here is the the sort of increase and decrease of water as it's passing out of the dam, right? So this is sort of like the water that's coming out from the turbines. And you see this very particular pattern, which is the peaking pattern. So going from passing, maybe 800 CFS to 15 minutes later passing, 14,000 CFS, doing that for a period of hours, and then dropping back down to 800 CFS daily. These graphs were modeled by the Nature Conservancy with a model that's housed at UMass Amherst. And so when we went into these conversations with Great River Hydro, from the resource perspective, what we would like to see ideally would be something that resembles these graphs, which is the natural hydrograph, right? So this is kind of like in your fantasy world, if these dams were not in the river, how the river would look in its natural flow in response to storms. And so again, in the sort of middle right there, you can see Tropical Storm Irene sort of shooting off the charts there in terms of the flow, but you see that it's much more gradual up, it's much more gradual down, right? We know that that is not a realistic expectation. The dams are, occupying an important place in the grid. They generate electricity, which we all use, which I'm using right now. And so what the next step was to think of, like, what is the middle ground? What would maintain the facilities and also allow us to get to a more natural hydrograph? And so this model is showing what's called inflow equals outflow. So essentially, instead of the water coming downstream and being held behind the dam to fill up the pond, it just gets passed through 24 hours a day, right? So that would imply like generating all the time, meaning that the inflow is equaling the outflow and headed right through the dam as it comes down. And you can see that this is more gradual than what they've been doing for the past 40 years, but not quite as, gradual as a natural hydrograph. So that's kind of the goal we were getting to. As I said, we had conversations for 6 months, very, very detailed conversations. And as a stakeholder group, collectively with Great River Hydro, came to this agreement that we were pretty pleased with in terms of how they're planning to operate for the next 40 years, which includes this model of inflow equals outflow. The water coming in will get passed through and generated as it goes out. It includes allowing them to have what are called flexible hours of operation, which you could think of as almost like a bank account of peaking, right? a different amount of time in the bank for each month. And the difference is dependent upon the habitat impacts. So in winter, things are frozen, there's no migratory fish. It makes sense for them to have more bankable hours of peaking, or, reduced peaking. In April to June, it's a very sensitive time for migratory species. So they're allowed 10 hours. And so, as you can see in each one of those months, there's a certain number of hours that they can essentially anticipate over the course of the month when they would want to peak. And the peak is also being constrained by a 1 foot bandwidth. So instead of allowing the pond level to go up and down by 2 to 3 feet, they have to maintain a 1 foot area that they would be dropping the pond down. They also will be up ramping and down ramping, meaning that instead of going from, say 800 CFS, which is a trickle, to 10,000 CFS, which is a 50-year storm in 10 minutes, they would ramp up over the course of an hour, say from 800 to 4,000, and then in the next hour from 4,000 to 500, to sort of mimic the natural change in how water would come up in a more natural storm. And then similarly, on the other side, when they have been peaking or putting a lot of water through to generate more electricity, they, over the course of the next several hours, would be sort of like ratcheting that down until they get back to whatever the inflow amount of water is going through the system, until they meet inflow. And one of the other constraints is that if they drop the impoundment a foot, they need to refill it within 48 hours. So we, Great River Hydro took some of the real data from a couple of years. We asked them for 4 different years, 4 different seasons, to sort of model this and show us what it would look like in comparison to what they've been doing. And so this graph is from the Wilder facility in February of 2009, for just that 1 month. And what you'll see is that if you look at the top 2 blue lines, the darker blue line is what the impoundment did in that month in 2009. So this is based on actual data. And so you can see there's that daily up and down of the impoundment from the peaking. The turquoise line is what it would look like under this new operating scenario, had they been running that way in February of 2009. And so you can see the impoundment level fluctuation is much smaller, and there's much fewer of them because they only have 65 hours to spend in that month. At the bottom, what you see is the red line is the flow coming out of the dam during the month of February every day. And you can see that peak, the sort of 0 to 60, that occurs every day in the red line. The dotted green line is the inflow equals outflow line, meaning that that would be the amount of water just being passed through the facility. And then the purple line is to show you when they are peaking. So you can follow, you see much of the time, the purple line and the green line are together. And that is when they are not peaking at all. They're just passing inflow and generating electricity as it goes through. When they separate, that's the moment when they peak for an hour or 2, and then they would go back. And so just a couple things to point out with this. Instead of having very little amount of water coming out of the dam all of the time, there will be more, which is good for the aquatic species to make sure that things don't get dewatered. And it is a much more gentle change in the water level, in the flows coming out, the velocity of the flows coming out, and the water level change behind the dam. This is another example in August of the same year, just to provide a different perspective on it. Again, in this month, they would have had, I think, 20 hours to peak. So you see there's only a few times when they're actually not running inflow equals outflow. And this is why we care, right? These guys, in addition to how people use the river. But there are a bunch of endangered species that live in the river and need it to reproduce. And so, you know, for instance, the dwarf wedge mussel, that little mussel there on the bottom left, often when they would be dropping down the impoundment, these guys might get dewatered and die and be dried out. You know, the other side, as the water shoots out from below the dam, a lot of these creatures could get washed away, right, in those bigger flows. So we feel that this change is going to be very protective to these critters. And so it'll improve the ecosystem in general, aquatic habitat in particular. And another really important thing is it will maintain their niche in the grid, and it maintains their ability as a facility to bid into the capacity market and respond to kind of system emergencies. So often hydroelectric facilities are kind of held back when everybody puts their air conditioner on, you know, the middle of a really hot August day. They get held back and they're the last thing to be called on to support the stability of the electric grid. If the grid goes down, it's the hydroelectric facilities that are called on first to restart it, because they can use the kinetic energy of the water to restart it. Sometimes, you know, if you think of like a coal-fired power plant, they actually need electricity to start. So the hydro plants can restart the grid. So they do play an important role. So as I said, when we had these discussions, we only talked about the operational flows. We did not talk about recreation mitigation. We didn't talk about enhancements for fish passage. We didn't specifically talk about, you know, mitigation for the erosion caused on the banks in the impoundment. And we didn't talk about cultural resources. So when when the company was putting forward their final application in December, we didn't know what else would be included for mitigation for these other kind of categories. And what we found we were pretty disappointed with was basically nothing. You know, they had been relying in their application to say that the operational change is enough, that is the protection and mitigation, and they're not going to do anything else. And for a 40 to 50 year license, that's really not acceptable. In that initial application in December, they said for recreation, they would maintain 3 of the primitive campsites that are part of the Connecticut River Paddlers Trail. They were going to slightly increase the operation of the fish ladders by a month from May to April to help support some of the resident species that, you know, swim up and down or would like to swim up and down to, you know, procreate. And then they will, in the future, you know, after this past December, discuss additional fish passage requirements with resource agency staff and then develop a programmatic agreement. You know, the idea of this application is that everything should be in it so the public can actually comment on what they are proposing. And so a lot of pieces were missing. We filed a letter to FERC in February, essentially saying that we felt the application was deficient, that, you know, a lot more details should have been fleshed out and provided. And over the course of the past couple of years, in like 2017 and 2018, we actually worked with the Appalachian Mountain Club on 2 different surveys to reach out to all of the communities in the project area. So that's really, you know, Vernon and Hinsdale at the Massachusetts border, all the way up to, you know, Piermont, Haverhill area. We reached out to all the towns. We've followed up on, you know, Great River Hydro's recreation study, and we put together a set of recreation recommendations that we put forward to FERC that we felt would be, you know, commensurate with a 40-year license with a company of this size with their income. And that includes, you know, upgrades like real ADA accessibility in a lot of areas of the river, improvements to portage locations, marketing the river as a destination resource, improvements to fish viewing facilities, especially at Vernon, to have that be an amenity in the town that people might come to as a tourist attraction, you know, historical and archaeological, interpretive programs, etc. Right? So there's a whole suite of things that they could be doing to mitigate for the impacts of the dam and provide for the recreation economy in the region. And initially, none of this was included. After they submitted their application, there's this period of time when FERC can request additional information. And so in response to one of FERC's requests for more detail about what they were going, their mitigation would cost over the 40 years, they provided 3 Excel spreadsheets that had some more detail that implied that they actually are intending to invest some more in some additional recreational things, cultural and historic things, and fish passage. And so, but these Excel spreadsheets, there was no narrative, there was no explanation, there was no detail. It was just like listed in these Excel spreadsheets. So there's still a lot of information lacking to understand what exactly they're going to do for mitigation over the course of the coming license. One of the things that has occurred recently too, I believe, is that the company has been engaging in conversations with the fisheries biologists, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and in the States, to talk about improvements to the fish passage, to the fish ladders, you know, as a result or under this new licensing. And these are the critters that, you know, that we're mostly concerned about. These are the migratory fish that come up the river to reproduce, some of which live in the river and go out to the ocean to reproduce, and they need to have safe and effective passage on their way up and down. So there are specific improvements. You know, right now, all of the fish ladders at Wilder, Bellows, and Vernon were built to pass Atlantic salmon. And as everybody knows, that that effort has been abandoned. And so they really need to be retrofitted to be more flexible and to successfully pass American eel, American shad, and sea lamprey. And so there will need to be some capital investments to make improvements to the ladders so that those species can pass upstream and downstream more effectively. And as I said, one of the other concerns was erosion along the rivers. This is a picture from Claremont, New Hampshire. And you know, that is not a natural riverbank. That is a riverbank that has been eroding underneath and slumping, you know, year after year. We do feel that the change in how the river, how they're going to operate may lessen the impact to the riverbanks, but we would like to see this monitored over the course of the coming license and have there be money in place to stabilize stream banks, buy out, you know, land from property owners if necessary, and address this issue. So we'll put a temporary kind of check mark on it, and we need to kind of wait and see. The other really exciting thing about this, to a certain extent, is that because this is a major change in how the water will be moving through the system, how the river will move, what it means is that over the course of the coming 10 to 20 years, we are going to see the habitat in the river and the tributaries shift. And so, you know, one way to look at it is, you know, the area behind the dam is still water most of the time right now. And so if you have a tributary that comes into that, it's fast water sort of running into slow moving water. And when that occurs, it drops its sediment. So all of the tributary mouths in at least the impoundments are pretty sediment filled. And so as the water starts to move through the facilities over the coming years more freely, it's going to move that sediment. And we may actually see shifts in terms of where sediment gets deposited in the river, you know, where islands form and what the mouths of the tributaries look like. Right now, that sort of thick sediment, that kind of muddy stuff at the mouth is not what our creatures were adapted to. You know, it's rocky, cobbly bottoms is the preferred sort of habitat. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. And we really feel it's a great opportunity, and Great River Hydro should support some research, either using like UVM or UNH to do ongoing monitoring of these changes over the course of the next 10 or 20 years. This is it's a major change that should be looked at and probably could be very useful from an academic perspective. So we have been, trying to educate everyone about this relicensing process for many years, but especially now, because as we are coming to the end of this period of it, there is going to be a public comment period. And we really need communities, organizations, individuals to comment to FERC and make it clear like what the communities would like to see for the river for the coming years, what the communities would like to see in terms of mitigation or financial support as mitigation over the coming years. And so, we're sort of reaching out to get people involved. We have a dedicated webpage where there's a lot more detailed information. You can sign up for the FERC docket to get notices as things are submitted. And we still are waiting for a kind of formal public comment period. At this point, we don't think that'll come until after November of this year, maybe later. So we're trying to gear everybody up, but then we have to say, wait, you got to wait till the public comment period opens. So plenty of time to dig in and do your research and learn more about this. And we are, glad to help, both myself as river steward in Vermont, New Hampshire, and then Andrea as my counterpart in Massachusetts, working on the relicensing of the 2 facilities down there. We are glad to, help answer questions, connect people to information. We plan to write some example sort of template comments and a how to comment to FERC thing and provide that to the public. So, we are your resource for any questions you may have. And so I'll end there. That's probably a lot of information, and, we can answer some questions.
Thank you so much, Kathy.
Sure.
I'm just gonna move this around. So anyone who's joined us, you are welcome to type questions in the chat on Zoom and comment on the video on Facebook. So we have a question here. What are the species of greatest concern in the Connecticut River and its tributaries? And how will the changes in management due to the new FERC regulations affect stressed species?
So I mentioned a couple of them. There are 12 freshwater mussels that are native to the Connecticut River watershed. 8 of them are endangered. And mussels move around through the watershed in a way where their little baby Glaucidia, go into the water column and attach to fish. And so they actually kind of attach to the gills of fish. And so if the fish are not able to move, those young mussels cannot find their way to new habitat. Similarly, like the dewatering of backwater areas and the flushing of areas can sort of decimate populations. And so, one of the species that is working on being protected right now in the Connecticut in particular is the dwarf wedge mussel. And so there's a lot of consideration about the impacts of these facilities on the dwarf wedge mussel. And again, as they change their operation to more closely mimic how a natural river would act, that's what the species are adapted to. So dwarf wedge mussel, there was a picture of a little cobblestone tiger beetle. Those guys are listed as endangered or threatened. And then all of the migratory fish. So American eel, sea lamprey, American shad, who am I forgetting? Herring. Forgetting somebody. Oh, further downriver, it's short-nosed sturgeon as well. They don't quite make it up this far, but so those are the main species of concern that sort of function as triggers. When you think about it, like they can be the canary in the coal mine, right? So if you make the river better for them, it's going to be better for everybody else too. So a lot of the resident species will also benefit from this change in terms of like how they can access different parts of the river and being protected from more extreme flows and things like that.
Thanks, Kathy. There's another question is, are there templates people can use to write comments when that period comes up?
That is we don't have it yet on our website, but that's one of the things that we're working on, is creating actually 3 documents. One would be like a how to comment to FERC with a step-by-step, like go to the website, click here, you know. The other document would be a kind of a template letter with how it would be addressed, how you might reference different parts of the application, what federal law you might reference for different things you want to, you know, make points of.
Mhm.
And then the third one will be a kind of a comparison of, you know, specific things that are, excuse me, in the application that Great River Hydro proposed, and then our perspective on what we think it should be, right? So our sort of example of it, this is what we would think, just to help to provide some context. And we have a dedicated email list. We call our hydropower email list. And so I would encourage people who might be interested in commenting to sign up for that on our website. And we don't use it very often, but it's exactly the type of, you know, once we have those documents set, we will send it out to that list. Once we have a, you know, once we know when the public comment period occurs, we will send it out to that list. So it's pretty infrequently emailed, but it's kind of important when it happens. So
Who would somebody contact to get on that list, the hydropower email list?
if you just go to our website,
Mhm.
ctriver.org, and there's probably like I'll see if I can find it really quick, a get involved
Okay.
page, and then you can choose, you know, hydropower email or Vermont, New Hampshire email. There's a few different ones
Okay,
you can.
great.
Yeah, and I can, if we get the link to that, I can send that out to everyone in the follow-up email to this, Kathy, as well. That'd be great.
Yeah, I will send you a list. I have a bunch of links of like other videos we've done. So there's a lot of background information that we can provide to folks as well.
All right. Thank you. Question here. Oh, gosh, sorry, this cat. Is Vermont's Agency of Natural Resources involved at all?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So because of the, to stick this link in the chat here, sorry. Because of Section 401 of the Clean Water Act, the states actually kind of need to be involved. And what that does, so Section 401 of the Clean Water Act gives the authority to states and tribes to essentially regulate and protect their own waters. So both Vermont and New Hampshire have developed water quality standards, which is something they're supposed to do under Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. And for projects like this, they have to issue a 401 certification. And basically it's a certification that the action of this facility or this project will not impair the water quality based on the standards that are set for the state. So after, so there's several like stages in this process. So there will be comments to FERC, and then at the same time that public comment period opens, the company is required to apply to both states for this 401 water quality certificate. The states will then draft a certificate, and the public can also comment on that. And those, what's interesting is that those certifications, whatever the state puts in there, automatically becomes part of the license. So it's actually, it can be quite a strong leverage if the state's water quality standards are strong. The other thing to understand is that the water quality standards cover a lot of different things. They, you know, obviously it's like the dissolved oxygen or how much nitrogen or chemicals and pollutants, but they also speak to access to recreation, to sediment, and to aesthetics even. So, you know, that both of the states have been involved like intimately through the whole process. And, you know, we've been lucky that way, honestly. I mean, Massachusetts has been a little less involved in the process down there, and we've been sort of knocking on their door.
This is maybe a silly question off of that, but why do Vermont water quality standards, why are they applicable if the river is technically not Vermont's, it's New Hampshire's?
The river is technically based on it's either the low or the high water mark before the dams were built. So the line is in fact, in most places, about 50 feet, 100 feet in the river. So if we find, a tank buried in the sediment and it is anywhere near the Vermont side of the river, and I call New Hampshire, they will tell me, no, that's not our problem. You got to call a Vermont hazmat team to figure out what's in that tank. So it's, the idea that New Hampshire owns the river is, New Hampshire, first of all, nobody owns the water. The water is ours in public trust. New Hampshire owns the land, or the landowners in New Hampshire, probably more likely, own the water under the river to a certain point, and then the east coast of the river or whatever, east coast of Vermont, it does go into the river a little ways. So there is a jurisdictional part.
Interesting.
Thank you. So before I ask the next question, one of the ways you can kind of get a sense of where that line isn't really right on the riverbank today is driving over the Ledyard Bridge. When they put the Ledyard Bridge, they tried to estimate where the riverbank was at the time that the lines were drawn between the two states. So there's a plaque about a third of the way over the Ledyard Bridge that says you're now entering New Hampshire. And when they first put it in, there were all kinds of letters to the editor saying, that's in the wrong place. It should be right on the bank. But at any rate, so the next question is, would the following be a plausible mitigation contribution for recreation? Adding accommodations for a bike pedestrian use on a bridge about to be repaired over the Wilder impoundment.
Yeah. I mean, I think, the company will attempt to split hairs and say, that there's on-site facilities and there's off-site recreation facilities, right? So they are going to try to insist that they will invest in their on-site facilities, which are the things that, like in the case of Wilder, are very close to the dam or are things that they own, right? So Kilowatt Park North and South are owned by the company. So they will put picnic tables there, or, our argument is that, when you're controlling 175 miles of water and people are attempting to possibly navigate that whole length and or navigate part of it and then get out and, recreate along the side of it or bird watch along the side of it, the mitigation should be done in a way that benefits all of the communities up and down the river on both sides in the project areas. And so, I believe it's a completely reasonable thing to ask for. And the question then becomes, how is there a system, or how could it be set up for the company to support those types of things? And so, for the previous relicensing of 15 Miles Falls, which is much further upriver by kind of Littleton, they set up a mitigation and enhancement fund to do, that can actually be used for a lot of different things. And so they could, and it looks like they are intending to do this, but not at an amount that we think is appropriate. They could do on-site mitigation and projects on their own land. And then it also looks like they are willing to set up some sort of kind of grant fund or pot of money that would help with additional like recreation enhancements in the communities. And I don't know how that would be structured, that would be part of what we would be, you would try to hammer out in the relicensing and sort of get as much detail as possible. But the amount that they have put in those Excel spreadsheets that I showed is really a pittance. I mean, I don't want to say the numbers off the top of my head, but, for facilities that are making, millions of dollars a year in profit, it's something like they're proposing to invest something like $58,000 a year in recreation. So it's, it really should be more.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. How much of an impact do comments have?
More than none. So, you know, like we're commenting, obviously, and there's a few other groups that are commenting, but we've been involved in this the whole time. And so what it comes down to is, you know, FERC really are in Washington. They are not here. They don't know what the river looks like, that, you know, other than like the pictures that are included in the application. You know, some of the staff came out 9 years ago at the beginning of the process. They don't understand our communities. They, you know, they don't understand what's important to our communities. So the bottom line is, if there are no comments, FERC will put what's in the license, what the company outlines for them, that the company indicates that they feel is good enough, right? The only way that they are going to require more is if they hear from other people. And I don't, you know, the comments I don't think need to be complicated. You know, it just, there needs to be enough of a collective voice that sort of brings to FERC, you know, helps them focus the attention on what the communities think is important.
And Kathy, you probably already mentioned this, but what's the time frame for when people should be looking to be able to make comments again?
We think after November at this point. And part of the complication is that because of these are two different companies with 5 facilities, FERC wants the process to move forward into the NEPA process, which is when they have to do an environmental analysis. They want to do the environmental analysis of all 5 facilities, which from an ecological perspective is a sound thing to do, right? So we agree with that. But what it means is that if there's a complication with Great River Hydro, it would slow down First Light. If there's a complication with First Light, it slows down Great River Hydro. So right now, you know, we had the opportunity to have these conversations with Great River Hydro in 2020. We're ready to comment. It doesn't, you know, I believe that Great River Hydro is talking to the fisheries biologist. Maybe there'll be an opportunity for more conversations to dig into more details or to come to more agreement. But there are some more questions happening with First Light right now that is delaying the process. And so they've actually asked for a sort of break in the process until November. So
Okay.
At the earliest, it'll be November. It could be, you know, some point next year.
Great. So when you get that information, if you could forward that to us, we'll put it out. We get the word out, help get the word out too.
Yeah.
The next question is, when doing site visits on dams that hydro companies are looking to relicense, can you share what key things to ask and raise with the companies?
It's very different for every facility because of the size, kind of, you know, the kind of species involved and things like that. I mean, I think from the community engagement perspective, recreational access is a big thing to ask for. And the other thing that really, frankly, for, you know, has not been addressed adequately at all in any of the relicensings is the perspective of traditional cultural peoples and their use of the river, their historical relationship with the river, and the areas of the river that may be, and I'm not just talking the Connecticut, I'm talking the tributary rivers as well, you know, the areas that may be considered sacred or important to creation stories. And so there should be, and there is supposed to be, through the National Historic Preservation Act, conversations with traditional peoples to identify where those areas are and what should be done to protect it, honor it, educate. You know, that conversation is supposed to be occurring. And so that's another, you know, thing that it's not our conversation to have, but we feel like to the extent that we can shed light on the fact that that's supposed to be occurring, we're trying to do that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Question, I'm just going down here. When might such an M&E fund be available? It's monitoring and evaluation, right? Monitoring and evaluation fund be available?
Yeah, the MEF was the Mitigation and Enhancement Fund, which is an actual fund that's managed right now through the New Hampshire Charitable Foundations, which was a result of the relicensing of the facilities up the river in 2002, I think that was. We don't know that we will have a fund like that. That FERC will not require that. That is something that would only come out of settlement discussions with the company, or them, providing that as an option for mitigation that they put forward in their application. And so they seem, because of those Excel spreadsheets, they seem to have kind of implied there will be this chunk of money, but we don't know anything other than that there's an amount written next to a vague description on a sheet. So those are some of the details that need to be worked out. And I mean, in terms of comments, that could be a comment from the public or from communities, right? That a fund like that would be useful and should be created in some way. And you could even comment on like how it should be created or how it could be held or something like that. What I have learned from doing that recreation survey and talking to a lot of towns is that many of the towns don't have the money to maintain access areas. So, and a lot of the impact to the access areas comes from the dam. So for instance, on the New Hampshire side, it's I think the Claremont boat launch, almost yearly, they have to go and dredge out the boat launch so that boats can be put into the water because the sediment builds up, and the sediment is building up because of the way that the dam is operated. So, providing a mechanism for money to be given to towns to maintain access areas, I think is a completely reasonable mitigation. We just, the devil is in the details in terms of like how much money is set aside and how that is set up. So.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any more comments. Did I miss any, Michael?
I don't think so. I did have one thought related to sites that are sensitive to Indigenous peoples, and I could just hear some of the Indigenous peoples that I know, as far as which sites are sacred, basically saying, which you probably know exactly what I'm going to say, Kathy, they're all sacred. So, and it's, that's the viewpoint that is very common. So.
Yeah, we did speak to someone who said, as we've been delving into these conversations, we've learned that, one of the tribal historic preservation officers from one of the tribes in Massachusetts said, well, really the whole river should be a traditional cultural property, because when you think of the landscape and the stories of, this Michael, like the river is integral to the stories of the people, right, and the history. So
yeah,
it would be great to figure out how to have those conversations and unfold that process, because it's not, in a lot of these sort of federal proceedings, it could be more robust. And so,
yeah, is that something that requests could be made by the public to allow Indigenous peoples to have a stronger voice in this process, or is that built into the process already?
It's supposed to be built into the process. There's a complication in that legally it's federally recognized tribes. And in Vermont and New Hampshire, there are no federally recognized tribes, they're state recognized tribes. And Great River Hydro has reached out to those state recognized tribes, but it becomes a question of like, are you checking the box off to say you did this? They did their report and they sent a few emails and said, it's like, well, we didn't hear back from anyone, so we think we're good. Oh, sorry, I may have to. Try to make that not be loud, but so it's a question of like, you know, how genuinely you're trying to do it and how much effort you put into it.
Yeah.
And you know, it could be done better than how it's being done. Is our feeling, thought.
So that would be a good area to make some comments on then. Can you actually comment on the process itself, or just suggestions having to do with the regs that the process is shepherding along?
You can comment on both. I mean, we've specifically, the process has been complicated over the past several years because of a couple things. One is that by statute, they had to submit a final license application by a certain date, when the studies had not been done and they had not actually submitted even a draft application that had anything of real, substance in it. So when the draft application was submitted several years ago, we commented on that and basically said, there's nothing here, there's nothing to comment on. So you're cutting the public out. This is supposed to be a public process where you get feedback from the public, but if you're not providing anything, there's nothing for anyone to actually comment on. So we have struggled feeling that the process itself has been sort of flawed over the years. And so when we commented in February, as I said, the public comment period has not opened yet, right? We commented anyway, and our comments included the fact that we felt that the application was deficient and that this is another step in the process, in what has essentially been a flawed process when, for years now, real substantial suggestions for what the company is planning to do has not been in place. And so this past December was the first time that we've actually seen anything. And it was pretty sparse. So, my feeling and what I'm essentially telling people is, FERC doesn't seem to be throwing comments out. You can comment at any time. I think that the comments that are made during the formal public comment period are clearly going to be more legally sound, right? Like than comments made outside of that period. But I think any, to a certain extent, it's like squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? So any additional attention brought to this relicensing just helps the FERC staff understand that it's important to the people who live in the region. So
okay, thank you. Yeah, so as Ginevra said, that's all the questions that we had. Is there anything that you'd like to add to wrap up, or?
No, I will share probably too much information, which I'm good at doing in an email, which I'm assuming Ginevra can pass on to everyone. And there's a lot of details on our website, and don't hesitate to reach out, email or call with specific questions. And I am glad to continue to come and explain this and talk to groups, ad infinitum until we get a new license. So don't hesitate to call on me if you think that would be useful.
I think it would be. I mean, we could have a special session when the public comment period opens up, maybe, and really highlight it for people, because although I'm sure you'll be really busy at that point, like doing that. Or maybe somehow if we could do that, I think that would be good to keep it in people's mind and let them know that there's specific links at that point and forms and that they could use.
Yeah, and I think a lot of because there's so much information and it's complicated, I'm encouraging people to start now. Like if you think you might want to comment, get the application and read it and familiarize yourself with the process and sign up for the docket if you can stand it. Just try to familiarize yourself as much as possible, because then when it comes to actual moment when you're submitting comments, you'll be in a better, more informed place. So
yeah, great.
And just so you know, Lorraine from the Battenkill Conservancy we'll be in touch because they have 3 dams being relicensed this year and a site visit next week. So great.
Yeah, nice
to
to
help,
hear
yeah.
from the Battenkill area.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Kathy. This has been
Yeah,
really,
thank you very much.
and I will be in touch. And so I can get an email out to everyone who attended.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks for
Bye.
everybody for joining us.